It was a quiet summer evening in the mountains of Montana when John Riker, a retired forest ranger, noticed something moving beyond the tree line. The sun had just begun to set, casting long golden rays across his weathered wooden porch. Then he saw it, a massive black bear, standing still, staring right at him. Most people would have run inside, bolted the doors, grabbed a rifle. But John didn't move. Because he knew this bear. He'd known him for years. And every year, like clockwork, the bear came back, always to the same porch, always to see the same man who had once saved his life. What made it strange wasn't just the bear's return. It was the way he looked at John, not with the cautious eyes of a wild creature, but with the calm familiarity of an old friend. This was not a random visit. It never was. John Riker had spent more than 3 decades as a forest ranger in the vast backcountry of Montana. He had seen every kind of weather, tracked every kind of animal, and walked into situations that most people would never dream of. Forest life teaches you things: how to read the subtle warnings of a changing wind, how to spot cougar tracks in fading light, how to hear the faintest movement in thick underbrush. But nothing in his years of training prepared him for the day he first met the bear. It was 10 years ago, in late September, just as the leaves were turning gold and the air was sharp with the first hints of winter. John was patrolling a remote fire road after a series of wildfires had ripped through the area. The fires had been fast and merciless, leaving behind blackened trees and a silence that felt unnatural. Even the usual forest chorus of birds and insects had gone still. That's when he saw it, a dark, unmoving shape on the side of the trail. From a distance, it could have been anything: a chunk of burned log, a fallen backpack, a shadow. But as John slowed his truck and stepped out, the shape resolved into something heartbreakingly alive. A bear cub. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its small body was smeared with ash and mud, fur clumped and wet, tiny ribs visible beneath its skin. The cub's eyes were half closed, and every breath seemed like a battle. John's eyes swept the area, searching for the mother. Bears rarely leave their young, and if she was close by, she would see him as a threat. But there was nothing: no movement in the charred brush, no tracks in the ash. That absence told him what he didn't want to believe: the mother was gone. Down the embankment, he spotted the remains of a burned campsite, a collapsed tent, melted coolers, the twisted skeleton of a folding chair. The fire must have hit while the camp was occupied. People had likely fled, but the wildlife had not been so lucky. John's training told him to let nature take its course. He knew the rules: you don't intervene with wild animals unless absolutely necessary. But when the cub gave a faint, broken whimper, something inside him shifted. He wasn't looking at a wildlife anymore. He was looking at a life, fragile, flickering, and about to go out. Without another thought, John took off his ranger jacket, knelt, and gently wrapped the cub inside. The little body was cold to the touch. "All right, little one," he murmured, voice low and steady, "we're gonna get you through this." Back at his cabin, John placed the cub near the wood stove, lining a small box with old towels. He found a dusty bottle in his emergency kit, one meant for feeding orphaned raccoons or foxes during rescue work, and filled it with warm milk. At first, the cub didn't respond, too weak to move. But as John gently nudged the bottle's tip to its mouth, a tiny tongue flicked out. Then another. Slowly, hesitantly, the cub began to drink. The hours that followed were a careful vigil. John kept watch through the night, feeding small amounts every couple of hours, checking breathing, keeping the fire alive. He even caught himself speaking to the cub softly, telling it stories about the forest as if it could understand. The cub would blink up at him now and then, its eyes hazy but beginning to focus. By morning, something had changed. The shallow, struggling breaths were a little steadier. The eyes stayed open longer. When John offered his hand, the cub nosed it weakly, inhaling his scent. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the cub would live long enough to see another night. But he did know one thing: from that moment forward, their paths had crossed for a reason. And in ways he couldn't have imagined, this was not the end of their story. It was only the very beginning. The next few weeks became a quiet, unspoken routine between John and the cub. In those early days, the little bear, who John would eventually name Bruno, had no strength to even stand. Every small movement seemed to cost him all the energy he had. His breathing was still shallow, and his fur smelled faintly of burned wood. But John was patient. He had been patient his whole life. John's cabin was deep in the woods, accessible only by a gravel road that most people wouldn't dare drive in winter. This isolation meant he had no neighbors, no traffic, and no curious strangers to stumble upon his temporary guest. It also meant no wildlife officers were likely to drop by unannounced. John wasn't exactly breaking the law. There were allowances for temporary rescue, but if authorities believed the cub was becoming habituated out to humans, they'd take him away to a rehabilitation center hundreds of miles away. John didn't want that. He wanted to give this little creature a fighting chance right here, in the land where it belonged. He started with small feedings every few hours, a mixture of milk replacer and a bit of honey for energy. At first, Bruno drank reluctantly, but within a week, his appetite grew. Soon, he began making small, clumsy movements around the cabin, sniffing everything with curious little grunts. John would sit in his old rocking chair near the wood stove, sipping coffee while the cub stumbled around on oversized paws, occasionally stopping to chew the corner of a rug or paw at the crackling logs in the firebox. But John knew that keeping Bruno indoors forever wasn't an option. Bears needed the forest. They needed to climb trees, forage for food, wade into streams. So, once Bruno was strong enough to walk without stumbling, John began short, cautious trips outside. At first, Bruno stayed glued to John's legs, sniffing the cold air and flinching at every rustle of leaves. But day by day, the cub's confidence grew. John would lead him down a narrow trail behind the cabin, pointing out edible plants, letting him paw through fallen logs for bugs, even introducing him to the icy thrill of a mountain stream. Bruno's first encounter with running water was almost comedic. He dipped a paw, yanked it back with a startled snort, then splashed in with both paws as if testing his bravery. There was one particular moment John never forgot. It was late afternoon, the sky painted with streaks of pink and gold. Bruno had been exploring the edge of the stream when he suddenly froze, nose twitching. A pair of mule deer had appeared across the water, their large eyes locked on the strange little bear. For a few long seconds, everything was silent except for the babbling current. Then Bruno made a sound, not a growl, but a soft, low hum, and the deer simply turned and walked away. It was the first time John saw something ancient in the cub's posture, a reminder that no matter how small he looked now, Bruno was born of the wild and would one day return to it. Still, letting go was easier said than done. By late spring, Bruno had grown from a fragile bundle of fur into a strong, playful young bear. His coat had thickened into a glossy black sheen, his eyes bright and intelligent. He could climb small trees, dig for roots, and swim confidently in the deeper pools of the stream. But every night, without fail, he returned to the porch, settling himself against the door as if it were his den. John wrestled with the decision for weeks. A part of him wanted to keep Bruno forever, to let him roam the woods by day but always return home. But that was a selfish thought, and John knew it. If Bruno stayed dependent on him, he'd never survive the harsh realities of the wild. And the wild was where he truly belonged. The day of goodbye came quietly. It was early summer, warm enough that the air was thick with the smell of pine and blooming wildflowers. John didn't speak much that morning. He simply led Bruno further down the trail than they had ever gone before, past the stream, past the meadow, into the deep heart of the forest. There, he knelt and rested a hand on the young bear's shoulder. "You're ready," he said, voice low but steady. "This is your home now. Not the cabin. Not the porch. This." Bruno tilted his head, eyes meeting John's. Then, with a final huff, he turned and ambled into the trees. John stood there for a long time after the sound of his paw steps had faded. The forest seemed bigger without that small shadow following him. Weeks passed. Then months. John went back to his solitary routines, chopping firewood, fishing the stream, tending his small garden. And though he never spoke it aloud, part of him wondered if Bruno had even survived. Then, one crisp autumn morning, John heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy paws on his porch. When he opened the door, there stood a much larger, stronger Bruno. His coat gleamed in the morning light, and in his mouth, he carried something, a small branch heavy with ripe berries. He dropped it at John's feet and gave a short, soft grunt. It wasn't a random visit. It never would be. From that day forward, every year, without fail, Bruno would return. Always in autumn. Always to the same porch. Always to the man who had once wrapped him in a ranger's jacket and given him back his life. The first year Bruno came back, John thought it was a fluke. Maybe the young bear's wandering path had simply crossed near the cabin. Maybe curiosity brought him to the porch. But the second year, and then the third, erased any doubt. This was no accident. Each autumn, usually in late September or early October, John would hear the slow, deliberate creak of the wooden boards under heavy paws. He'd step outside to see Bruno standing there, older, broader, and stronger than the year before, yet still with that familiar steady gaze. And without fail, Bruno would bring something with him. One year, it was a salmon, freshly caught from the stream. Another, it was a bundle of pine boughs scented with resin. Once, in what John could only interpret as a peculiar sort of bear humor, Bruno dragged an entire fallen log onto the porch, dropped it with a thud, and sat back as if expecting John to be impressed with his woodworking skills. John never fed him. That was important. These visits weren't about hunger. They weren't about dependency. They were something else, something deeper. A bond that existed beyond survival, beyond species, beyond any reasonable explanation. As the years passed, the rhythm of these visits became part of John's life. He'd prepare in small ways, mending the porch boards so they wouldn't splinter under those massive paws, clearing the space where Bruno liked to sit. Sometimes, they'd simply share the quiet, John in his rocking chair with a mug of coffee, Bruno lying on the porch watching the shifting tree lean. Other times, John would speak, his words rolling into the cool air as though Bruno could understand every syllable. And perhaps, in his own way, he could. But time, as John knew well, was relentless. By the 10th year, John's hair had turned completely white. His hands, once steady, trembled faintly when he held his coffee cup. The hikes into the forest became shorter. He still chopped his own wood, but more slowly now. The cabin felt bigger, emptier in the months between Bruno's visits. Bruno had changed too. He was enormous now, a mature black bear in the prime of his strength. His neck was thick, his shoulders rippled with muscle, and his movements were deliberate, controlled. Yet, when he approached John, there was no sign of the wild aggression that such a powerful animal could show. His head would lower slightly, almost respectfully. He never pushed, never threatened, never broke the fragile peace they shared. One year, during a late autumn snow, Bruno arrived earlier than usual. John noticed a scar along the bear's flank, fresh, raw, and ugly. Something had tried to take him down, maybe a rival bear, maybe a mountain lion. Without thinking, John fetched a bucket of warm water, a rag, and the small tin of salve he kept for his own injuries. It took hours of patience, but Bruno allowed him to clean the wound. That night, the big bear didn't leave. He slept curled at the edge of the porch, snow piling on his back like a blanket. It was moments like these that made John realize this wasn't just about gratitude for the rescue long ago. This was a friendship, rare and unspoken, but as real as any bond he'd ever had with another living soul. But nature has its own plans. In the 13th year of Bruno's visits, something changed. For the first time, John didn't hear the creak of the porch boards in autumn. The weeks passed. Then months. Winter came and went, and still no sign of Bruno. John told himself it was natural. Wild animals roamed far. Sometimes they disappeared and never came back. But deep down, the absence gnawed at him. He would catch himself glancing toward the tree line in the mornings, listening for the sound of heavy paws. Nothing. It wasn't until the following spring, on a cool morning thick with the scent of wet earth, that John heard it, the sound of something large moving through the brush. He stepped outside, heart pounding, expecting to see Bruno's familiar shape. What he saw stopped him cold. From the shadows emerged a smaller bear, younger, with glossy black fur and bright, cautious eyes. And trailing behind him was Bruno. Slower now, his muzzle streaked with gray, his movements heavier. But still him. And for the first time, John realized the truth: Bruno hadn't just come back for himself. He had brought someone with him. John stood frozen on the porch, his breath caught halfway between a laugh and a gasp. The smaller bear stayed near the tree line, ears twitching, every muscle alert to the strange human figure in front of the cabin. Bruno, however, moved forward, slow, deliberate, his great paws pressing deep into the damp earth. The years had taken their toll. His coat, once sleek, had lost its luster in patches. His shoulders, though still broad, sagged ever so slightly. Yet his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, were unchanged. John stepped forward too, each movement measured. When they were only a few feet apart, Bruno stopped. For a long moment, man and bear simply looked at one another, the years between their first meeting and now compressing into a single point in time. Then, something unexpected happened. Bruno turned his head toward the young bear and let out a low, rolling sound, not a growl, but a vocalization John had never heard before. The younger bear hesitated, then took a few tentative steps forward. His claws clicked softly on the porch boards as he drew nearer, sniffing the air in John's direction. It dawned on John then, this was no random companion. This was Bruno's offspring. Bruno had come back not for himself, but to introduce his cub, now nearly grown, to the man who had once saved his life. The realization hit John like a wave. All the years of quiet companionship, the gifts left on the porch, the silent understanding between them, it all led to this. A legacy passed not through words or handshakes, but through trust. The three of them stood together for a while in the soft spring light. The younger bear, still cautious, circled once and sat at the far end of the porch, watching. Bruno lowered himself to the boards and lay there, his massive head resting on his forepaws. John eased into his old rocking chair, feeling the wood creak beneath him. Hours passed like minutes. They didn't need to speak. The forest spoke for them, wind in the pines, the distant rush of meltwater in the stream, the occasional chirp of a bird newly returned from migration. As the sun dipped lower, Bruno stood. He looked once at John, then at his offspring, and started back toward the trees. The younger bear followed, glancing over its shoulder only once before vanishing into the shadows. John knew, in the quiet that followed, that this had been the last visit. Bruno was old now. The next winter might be too much for him. The younger bear would roam far, carve his own life into the mountains. But the porch, this meeting place, would always hold their story. That night, John sat alone by the fire, the image of Bruno's graying muzzle and the bright eyes of the younger bear etched into his mind. He felt no sadness, only a deep, unshakable gratitude. Because not everyone gets to meet a wild creature. And fewer still are given the gift of being remembered by one. In the weeks that followed, John found himself scanning the edge of the forest every morning. The habit was impossible to break. A flicker of shadow, the snap of a twig, the flash of brown fur in the sunlight, each made his heart leap with hope. But no bear came. Word of Bruno's last visit began to spread in the nearby town. It started with a passing comment to the hardware store owner, "He brought his young one this year," and somehow, within days, everyone knew. The story took on a life of its own. Some locals spoke of Bruno as if he were a guardian spirit of the mountain, a wild protector who had chosen John as his human counterpart. Others swore the visits were a sign of something bigger, a reminder that the barrier between the wild and the civilized world wasn't as thick as people thought. And while John never sought attention, the tale of the bear who came back every spring became a kind of folk legend. Hunters claimed they'd seen the younger bear near the ridge, large now, with the same steady gaze as his father. Hikers whispered about a cabin porch where a man and a bear had once sat side by side without fear. One afternoon in early summer, a young couple from town knocked on John's door. They held a sketch, a beautiful pencil drawing of an old man in a rocking chair with a great bear beside him. "We heard the story," the woman said softly, "and we wanted you to have this." John took the drawing, his throat tightening. He hung it on the wall above the fireplace, where it caught the light each evening. Years slipped by. The cabin aged with him. The forest grew thicker, the winters harsher. Still, sometimes, on still nights when the moon hung low over the pines, John would hear a distant, familiar sound, a deep, rolling vocalization, carried faintly on the wind. He liked to think it was the younger bear, somewhere out there in the darkness, remembering. When John passed away quietly in his sleep one autumn, the people of the valley came together to honor him. They placed a simple wooden bench on his porch with a small brass plaque. "Here sat John Carter, friend to the wild." The cabin still stands, weathered and half swallowed by the forest. And sometimes, on misty mornings, hikers swear they've seen a large, dark shape moving just beyond the trees. Watching the porch. Waiting. Whether it's the son of Bruno or his son's son, no one knows. But the legend endures, of a man who once saved a bear, and a bear who never forgot. Years after John's passing, the cabin remained a quiet sentinel on the edge of the forest. Moss crept up the steps, pine needles collected thick on the roof, and vines curled along the porch railings. But the place never truly felt abandoned. The locals noticed strange patterns, footprints in the mud that were too large to belong to any dog, and too far from the wild to be from a passing grizzly. The marks were deep, deliberate, and they always stopped at the edge of the porch, before turning back toward the woods. Old Mrs. Halvorson, who lived down the ridge, claimed she saw it first. One winter morning, while chopping kindling, she spotted a massive figure standing just past the tree-line, perfectly still, as if listening. When she looked again, it was gone, leaving only the whisper of snow falling from the branches. As the years rolled on, a pattern emerged. Sightings came in the spring, always around the time the first green shoots pushed through the forest floor. They never lasted more than a minute or two, and no one could get close enough for proof. Some believed the bear was a descendant of Bruno, retracing his ancestors' path out of instinct. Others swore it was Bruno himself, a spirit bound to the place where he had known trust. Hunters avoided the ridge out of respect, telling younger sportsmen, "That's not our ground to take." Every so often, the valley's children would make the trek up to John's porch on warm summer days. They'd sit in the rocking chair, hands resting on the armrests where John's had worn the wood smooth, and tell each other the story. It became a kind of rite of passage to sit in that chair and listen for the deep quiet of the forest, hoping for a rustle in the pines. Then came the spring of the fire. A lightning strike in late May sparked a blaze deep in the valley. It burned fast and hot, swallowing acres of old growth. The smoke rolled over the mountains and poured into the lowlands, turning the sky a sickly orange. Fire crews fought for days to keep it from reaching the old cabin. When the smoke cleared, the building stood, charred at the edges, but still whole. And on the blackened porch boards, the fire chief found something he couldn't explain, a fresh, wet paw print, perfectly formed, right beside the brass plaque. Word spread faster than the fire ever could. To the valley folk, it was a sign, the legend was alive, and the bond between man and bear had outlasted even the flames. From then on, whenever the wind moved through the trees just right, carrying the deep, steady rumble of something large in the distance, people would pause, listen, and smile. Because in their hearts, they knew, somewhere out there, the forest still remembered. That summer, the mountains felt uneasy. It wasn't something you could see right away. It was in the air, thicker, heavier, with a faint tang that stung the nose. John had lived in the Rockies long enough to know that smell, dry pine sap and dust, carried by winds that whispered of drought. Every morning, he'd step out onto his porch with a mug of black coffee, scanning the ridgeline. Normally, the peaks stood sharp and blue against the sky. Now, some days, they looked hazy, almost ghost-like. And Bruno noticed too. The bear had grown into a massive creature by now, his shoulders rolling like boulders as he moved, his fur carrying the deep sheen of health. Yet, even from a distance, John could see a change. The easy, lazy swats Bruno gave to moths on warm afternoons were gone. He spent more time standing still, nose lifted, sniffing. One July morning, Bruno came earlier than usual, before sunrise. The mist still hung low over the meadow, and the grass glittered with dew. John was on his porch, rubbing his knees after a long night of restless sleep, when he saw the shadow move between the trees. Bruno emerged, his paws wet from crossing the creek, his breath steaming in the cool air. But he didn't come close at first. He stood just beyond the fence, head tilted toward the west. John followed his gaze. There, far off, where the mountains dipped into a valley, was a faint, rising plume of smoke. John set down his mug. "Too early in the season for campfires," he muttered. He went inside, grabbed the binoculars from the mantel, and steadied them against the porch post. The smoke was faint but steady, the kind that didn't come from a cabin chimney. No flicker of orange yet, but he knew it was there. By noon, the wind shifted. The smoke grew thicker, crawling over the ridges like a living thing. It brought with it the acrid sting of burning pine needles. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries sharper than usual. Even the squirrels that often darted along the porch rail had vanished. That night, the fire crept closer. John could see it now, not just smoke, but the faint pulse of red deep in the timber. He tried calling the ranger station, but the line was busy for hours. When he finally got through, the voice on the other end was taut and rushed. "Yeah, we know about it, John. Lightning strike 2 days ago, winds fanned it east. We're stretched thin. Just be ready to move if it turns." Move. The word sat in his stomach like a stone. He had lived here for decades. His porch, his land, his stories, and Bruno. The bear came back the next day, moving with a pace John had never seen before, quick, almost urgent. He circled the porch twice, sniffing the ground, then lifted his head toward the wind. His ears twitched. John followed his gaze again, but this time there was no need for binoculars. The fire was visible, a jagged orange glow along the mountainside, licking the night sky. By the third day, ash began to fall. Tiny flakes drifted through the air, landing in John's beard, settling on the porch rail like dirty snow. The sky had turned a bruised yellow, the sun a dim copper disk. Every breath tasted of smoke. Bruno stayed close that day. He lay near the fence, his massive body stretched out, his head resting on crossed paws. His eyes followed John constantly. At one point, John sat on the steps, and the bear rose, walked to the fence, and stopped just short. Their eyes met through the shifting haze. It struck John then, this wasn't just instinct. Bruno wasn't only warning him. He was staying with him. Night brought no relief. The fire had crept down into the valley, its roar carried on the wind like distant thunder. In the eerie glow, the forest no longer looked like home. Shadows danced wildly as trees burned, the sound of snapping timber echoing like gunfire. John packed a small bag, not much, just essentials, but he didn't leave. He kept stepping out onto the porch, scanning the dark, and every time, Bruno was there. On the fourth morning, the evacuation order came. A ranger's truck pulled up the dirt road, headlights cutting through the thick smoke. "John, time to go. Wind's turning, fire'll be here by nightfall." John glanced at Bruno, who stood now, muscles tensed. "I'm not leaving without him," John said, nodding toward the bear. The ranger's face twisted. "John, you know that's not how it works." Bruno huffed, a low, deep sound that rumbled through the air. For a moment, man and bear stood side by side, both looking toward the oncoming fire. The ranger's voice softened. "You've got maybe 2 hours." When the truck drove away, John crouched near the fence. "I don't know if you understand me, boy, but you need to go. You can get higher into the mountains, away from this." Bruno didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, closer than he'd come in years, until the fence was the only thing between them. His dark eyes locked on John's, and for the briefest second, it felt like neither of them was wild, or human, or anything else. Just 2 old friends. The first embers drifted onto the porch. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a tree exploded in a burst of flame. The roar was closer now, the air hotter. John stood, his heart pounding. "All right, old boy, let's make it count." The fire wasn't going to wait. The summer after the fire was strangely silent in the valley. For the first time in over a decade, John's porch remained empty. The woodpile sat untouched, the railing unstained by the heavy paw prints that usually marked the start of summer. The mountains themselves seemed quieter, as if the wildlife had retreated into some unspoken mourning. The wildfire had burned hotter and longer than anyone had predicted. It had chewed through acres of forest, devoured cabins, and left a patchwork of ash and blackened stumps where lush green pines once stood. The air still held a faint, acrid scent of smoke that the rain couldn't wash away. Even months later, the charred skeletons of trees stood like silent sentinels, a graveyard to the life that once thrived there. John tried to tell himself that maybe Bruno had just moved on. Bears didn't follow human calendars, after all. Maybe the fire had pushed him deeper into the wilderness, closer to untouched valleys and cooler streams. That's what he said out loud to the occasional visitor who asked about the bear. But at night, when he sat alone with the porch light off, he knew the truth he didn't want to say. Animals don't always survive fires like that. And Bruno had already cheated death once. Through autumn and into the first snow, John waited. He would often find himself looking out the window in the early hours before dawn, when the fog rolled low through the trees, half expecting to see a familiar dark shape emerge from the mist. But nothing came. Then, one crisp morning in late February, it happened. John was chopping firewood behind the cabin when he heard a sound, faint at first, almost lost in the whistle of the wind. It wasn't the crack of branches or the rustle of deer. It was heavier, slower. Something was moving down the trail toward the cabin. He froze, axe in hand, heart thudding in his chest. Out of the corner of his eye, through the thin veil of snow falling from the pines, he saw him. Bruno. The bear was thinner than John remembered, his fur duller and streaked with soot-like stains, but there was no mistaking that wide, blunt muzzle and the slow, deliberate way he walked. His left ear had a small notch now, perhaps from a fight, perhaps from the fire, and his eyes, though still deep and knowing, seemed older. John dropped the axe without thinking and stepped forward. "Bruno, you made it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. The bear stopped a few yards away, as he always did, watching John the way he had from the very first year. The air between them was filled with tiny flakes of snow drifting lazily down. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink until it was just man and bear, bound by something older than language. Then Bruno did something he had never done before. He stepped off the trail and walked up to the porch itself. His massive paw touched the first wooden step, leaving a perfect print in the thin layer of snow. John's breath caught. Slowly, Bruno climbed up, one step at a time, until he stood right at the edge of the porch. He lowered his head, sniffing the air around John, and then, in a gesture so subtle it might have been missed, he leaned his head ever so slightly forward. John didn't touch him. He knew better than to break the unspoken rules between them. But he did take one slow step closer, meeting the bear's dark eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered. The moment lasted only seconds. Bruno turned, lumbered back down the steps, and padded toward the tree-line. But halfway there, he stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and made a deep, rumbling exhale, a sound John had come to recognize as the closest thing to a bear's farewell. And then he was gone, swallowed by the forest. That night, John sat on the porch long after the stars had come out. He didn't feel sadness this time. He knew Bruno would return again, maybe next summer, maybe the one after that. The fire had tested them both, but some bonds are too stubborn to be burned away. In the quiet stillness, John realized something. It wasn't just the bear who came back to the porch every year. It was him, too. He stayed in this cabin, in these mountains, because he was waiting, always waiting, for that familiar shadow to appear at the edge of the woods. And when it did, no matter how many years had passed, the world felt whole again. The summer after the fire was strangely silent in the valley. For the first time in over a decade, John's porch remained empty. The woodpile sat untouched, the railing unstained by the heavy paw prints that usually marked the start of summer. The mountains themselves seemed quieter, as if the wildlife had retreated into some unspoken mourning. The wildfire had burned hotter and longer than anyone had predicted. It had chewed through acres of forest, devoured cabins, and left a patchwork of ash and blackened stumps where lush green pines once stood. The air still held a faint, acrid scent of smoke that the rain couldn't wash away. Even months later, the charred skeletons of trees stood like silent sentinels, a graveyard to the life that once thrived there. John tried to tell himself that maybe Bruno had just moved on. Bears didn't follow human calendars, after all. Maybe the fire had pushed him deeper into the wilderness, closer to untouched valleys and cooler streams. That's what he said out loud to the occasional visitor who asked about the bear. But at night, when he sat alone with the porch light off, he knew the truth he didn't want to say. Animals don't always survive fires like that. And Bruno had already cheated death once. Through autumn and into the first snow, John waited. He would often find himself looking out the window in the early hours before dawn, when the fog rolled low through the trees, half expecting to see a familiar dark shape emerge from the mist. But nothing came. Then, one crisp morning in late February, it happened. John was chopping firewood behind the cabin when he heard a sound, faint at first, almost lost in the whistle of the wind. It wasn't the crack of branches or the rustle of deer. It was heavier, slower. Something was moving down the trail toward the cabin. He froze, axe in hand, heart thudding in his chest. Out of the corner of his eye, through the thin veil of snow falling from the pines, he saw him. Bruno. The bear was thinner than John remembered, his fur duller and streaked with soot-like stains, but there was no mistaking that wide, blunt muzzle and the slow, deliberate way he walked. His left ear had a small notch now, perhaps from a fight, perhaps from the fire, and his eyes, though still deep and knowing, seemed older. John dropped the axe without thinking and stepped forward. "Bruno, you made it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. The bear stopped a few yards away, as he always did, watching John the way he had from the very first year. The air between them was filled with tiny flakes of snow drifting lazily down. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink until it was just man and bear, bound by something older than language. Then Bruno did something he had never done before. He stepped off the trail and walked up to the porch itself. His massive paw touched the first wooden step, leaving a perfect print in the thin layer of snow. John's breath caught. Slowly, Bruno climbed up, one step at a time, until he stood right at the edge of the porch. He lowered his head, sniffing the air around John, and then, in a gesture so subtle it might have been missed, he leaned his head ever so slightly forward. John didn't touch him. He knew better than to break the unspoken rules between them. But he did take one slow step closer, meeting the bear's dark eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered. The moment lasted only seconds. Bruno turned, lumbered back down the steps, and padded toward the tree line. But halfway there, he stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and made a deep, rumbling exhale, a sound John had come to recognize as the closest thing to a bear's farewell. And then he was gone, swallowed by the forest. That night, John sat on the porch long after the stars had come out. He didn't feel sadness this time. He knew Bruno would return again, maybe next summer, maybe the one after that. The fire had tested them both, but some bonds are too stubborn to be burned away. In the quiet stillness, John realized something. It wasn't just the bear who came back to the porch every year. It was him, too. He stayed in this cabin, in these mountains, because he was waiting, always waiting, for that familiar shadow to appear at the edge of the woods. And when it did, no matter how many years had passed, the world felt whole again. The years began to pass in a quiet rhythm. Spring brought the sound of melting snow trickling through the gullies, summer brought the green flush back to the burned slopes, and with each new season, John would find himself glancing toward the edge of the woods, scanning for a familiar shape. Bruno's visits grew less frequent but never stopped. Sometimes it was every summer, sometimes 2 years would slip by before John saw him again. Age was catching up to them both. John's knees ached more with each winter, and Bruno's coat had turned from glossy black to a softer, grizzled brown. But each time they met, it was as if no time had passed, a simple exchange of silent recognition, as steady as the changing of the seasons. One particular summer morning, the sun broke over the mountains in a blaze of orange and gold, lighting the valley in a way John hadn't seen in years. He was sitting on the porch with his coffee, listening to the chorus of birdsong, when he caught movement at the tree lean. Bruno. This time, the bear moved slowly, his steps deliberate, almost ceremonial. His bulk was smaller than before, a sign of age, but his presence was just as commanding. John noticed something else. The bear wasn't alone. Behind Bruno, half hidden in the morning mist, padded a smaller figure, a young bear, sleek and strong, its eyes darting between the man on the porch and the older bear beside it. John's heart clenched. He realized what he was seeing. Bruno was introducing his successor. The young bear hung back at the tree lean, unsure, but Bruno walked forward until he reached the porch steps, the same spot he had stopped at for years. The two locked eyes again, and John felt an ache he couldn't quite name. Bruno glanced over his shoulder once, toward the younger bear, then back to John, and for the first time in all these years, he gave a low, soft growl, a sound not of threat, but of acknowledgement. It was as if he was saying, "This is my place. This is my friend. Remember this." The younger bear didn't come forward, but it didn't leave either. It stood in the morning light, studying the man on the porch, while Bruno lingered a moment longer, his breath misting in the cool air. And then, slowly, the old bear turned and walked back toward the tree lean, the younger one falling into step beside him. That was the last time John saw him. He didn't realize it at the moment, of course. He kept expecting Bruno to return the following summer, and the one after that. But as the years rolled on, the visits stopped. The forest remained alive with other creatures, deer, foxes, even the occasional black bear, but none of them carried that same weight of history, that same quiet understanding. One autumn evening, now well into his 80s, John sat on the porch wrapped in an old quilt, watching the sun dip below the mountains. The forest was a rich tapestry of gold and crimson, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. As the shadows deepened, he caught movement at the tree lean once more. It wasn't Bruno. But it was the younger bear, now fully grown, its coat thick and healthy. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching John in the fading light. The moment stretched between them, and John smiled, a slow, contented smile. The bear didn't come closer. It didn't need to. John raised his hand in a small wave, the same way he had done to Bruno all those years ago. And with that, the bear melted back into the forest. John knew then that Bruno's visits had never really been about habit or curiosity. They were about connection, a thread tying two very different lives together across time, through fire and frost, through loss and change. And now, that connection had passed on, as all living things must, but the bond remained unbroken. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, John sat a little longer than usual. He thought about the first time he'd found that frightened cub tangled in the old wire fence, and how that moment, that single decision to help, had shaped the rest of his life. He thought about the quiet summers and the cold winters, the way the forest had burned and healed, and the way some friendships endure even without words. And somewhere deep in the woods, whether in this world or another, he liked to believe Bruno still walked the trails, still found his way to the porch in the cool light of dawn.